At 69 years old, after 40 years of quiet devotion, she was thrown onto the street with nothing but 2 scuffed leather suitcases and exactly $22 to her name. She spent 11 of those dollars on a rusted, rotting train depot at the overgrown edge of the woods, a collapsed structure the entire town viewed as a hazardous eyesore. But what she eventually unearthed beneath the shattered floorboards of the abandoned ticket office would leave the man who ruthlessly discarded her gasping for air. Stay with me until the end of the video to see how a forgotten woman turned a pile of scrap iron into an empire, and how the scales of justice always balance themselves in the end. Evelyn did not cry. She simply stood on the cracked concrete sidewalk. Behind her, the heavy oak front door of the estate, the very door she had sanded, stained, and polished with her own hands 3 decades ago, clicked shut. The lock engaged with a sharp, heavy thud. The temperature was dropping steadily, hovering somewhere near 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and the autumn wind bit cruelly through the thin fabric of her beige wool coat. For 40 years, Evelyn had been the invisible foundation of a life she was no longer allowed to inhabit. She looked down at her hands. The skin was paper-thin, marked by age spots and the subtle, permanent scars of endless labor. Her mind drifted back to the sweltering summers of the early 80s. She remembered the suffocating 85-degree nights in their unair-conditioned apartment, sorting carbon copy invoices by the dim light of a single bulb, scrubbing thick engine grease out of Arthur's heavy canvas coveralls, making countless pots of bitter coffee, answering ringing telephones until her throat felt like sandpaper, and managing the chaotic schedule of their fledgling freight company. She had been the one to drive hundreds of miles up and down the interstate, delivering urgent documents when they could not afford a courier. She had hauled heavy cardboard boxes weighing 50 pounds each up narrow staircases. She had nursed Arthur through his terrifying bout of pneumonia, pressing damp cloths to his burning forehead for 3 sleepless nights, while simultaneously balancing the company ledgers on her tired lap. She had built the man. Then the man erased her. The divorce proceedings had been a masterclass in calculated bureaucratic cruelty. It did not happen with a fiery argument or shattered glass. It happened in a sterile, brightly lit conference room downtown, surrounded by walls of legal volumes and the faint hum of central heating. Arthur arrived flanked by a team of slick, sharp-faced attorneys who wore silk ties and spoke in a rapid, suffocating language of corporate loopholes, depreciating assets, and hidden clauses. They systematically dismantled Evelyn's existence over the course of 3 excruciating hours. They slid thick stacks of paper across the polished mahogany table. They pointed to offshore accounts she had never seen, shell corporations she had never heard of, and an outdated, heavily manipulated financial agreement she had naively signed when she was 29 and blindly, foolishly in love. The division of assets was not a negotiation. It was a slaughter. Arthur sat directly across from her, his posture relaxed, his custom-tailored suit immaculate, his silver hair perfectly styled. He looked at her not with anger, but with absolute, chilling indifference. It was the look a man gives a broken tool before tossing it into the garbage. He claimed the freight company entirely, citing his legal position as the sole primary shareholder. He kept the sprawling 5-acre suburban estate. He retained the massive investment portfolios. He took the 3 vintage cars parked in the heated garage. "It is strictly business, Evelyn," he muttered coldly, adjusting his expensive gold cufflinks. "You have to be realistic." She had stared at him. The man she had fed, bathed, comforted, and protected for over 14,000 days was looking through her as if she were made of glass. The lawyers had smiled politely, handing her a pen. They granted her a meager, insulting settlement, a sum that evaporated almost instantly, swallowed whole by the aggressive, mounting legal fees she had been forced to incur just to sit in that room and understand her ruin. When the final decree was stamped and the heavy doors of the courthouse swung shut, Evelyn walked out into the gray afternoon light with a hollow chest. She checked her worn leather wallet. She had exactly $22. That was the entirety of her net worth. She walked away from the grand estate. She did not scream. She did not beg. She did not fall to her knees on the manicured lawn she had watered every morning for 20 years. She simply gripped the handles of her 2 small suitcases and began to walk down the long, winding driveway. The gravel crunched under her sensible shoes. She walked half a mile to the bus stop, blending into the shadows of the towering oak trees. The world moved on around her. Cars sped past. People laughed on the sidewalks. No one noticed the 69-year-old woman carrying the fragmented remains of her life in 2 small bags. She paid the $3 bus fare, sliding into a plastic seat at the back. The engine rumbled. She was entirely alone, but she was still breathing.
Evelyn spent her first night of absolute poverty, curled up in the rusted back seat of a derelict 1978 Ford station wagon, hidden away in the tall, dead weeds behind a 24-hour highway diner. The temperature plummeted to a bitter 35 degrees Fahrenheit. She pulled her thin beige wool coat tighter around her frail shoulders, tucking her knees tightly against her chest to preserve whatever meager body heat she could generate, listening to the heavy diesel engines of massive freight trucks rumbling on the interstate a quarter-mile away, smelling the stale grease and burnt onions from the diner's exhaust vents, and feeling the sharp, broken metal springs of the ruined upholstery digging relentlessly into her lower spine. She closed her eyes in the darkness. She did not weep. She simply endured. When dawn finally broke, casting a pale, freezing gray light over the cracked asphalt parking lot, she climbed out of the rusted shell with stiff, aching joints. She dragged her 2 heavy leather suitcases into the diner, washing her face with freezing tap water in a stained porcelain sink, smoothing down her silver hair with trembling fingers. She walked to the counter, ordering a single slice of dry wheat toast and a small cup of black coffee. The bill came to exactly $8. Evelyn reached into her worn pocket, pulling out the remaining cash from her original $22. She had spent $3 on the bus the previous afternoon. She handed over the $8 to the weary waitress. She looked at the crumpled bills left in her palm. $11. That was the entire sum of her earthly wealth. As she carried her empty paper cup toward the exit, her eyes caught a flash of bright yellow paper pinned beneath a layer of clouded, peeling Scotch tape on the diner's community bulletin board. It was a municipal tax foreclosure notice, the cheap ink heavily faded by months of harsh afternoon sunlight, advertising a public auction for condemned, abandoned properties. Her eyes scanned slowly past the expensive residential lots, the multi-story commercial storefronts, and the paved industrial zones, settling on the very last item printed at the absolute bottom of the page. Property ID 402, the old Oak Haven train depot. It sat on 3 acres of densely wooded, overgrown land, located exactly 6 miles outside the city limits. The structure had been completely abandoned since 1971. The roof was listed as partially collapsed. The heavy steel rails had been violently torn up for scrap metal decades ago, and the local city council simply wanted the rotting hazard removed from their liability ledger. The minimum administrative transfer fee to claim the deed was listed in bold black ink. Exactly $11. Evelyn stared at the number for a long, silent moment. It was waiting for her. She walked the entire 6 miles to the county courthouse, her sensible brown shoes blistering her heels with every step, her 2 heavy leather suitcases dragging agonizingly behind her over the uneven concrete sidewalks, the muddy drainage ditches, and the dusty gravel shoulders of the rural highway. Inside the warm, brightly lit municipal building, the county clerk, a young, arrogant man wearing a flashy polyester suit, sporting excessive hair gel, and chewing loudly on peppermint gum, looked down at Evelyn with a sickening mixture of profound pity and barely concealed disgust. He drummed his perfectly manicured fingers on the polished laminate counter, staring incredulously at the 11 crumpled $1 bills she had meticulously flattened out and placed before him. "Lady, you do not want this property," he stated mockingly, letting out a harsh, patronizing laugh that echoed in the quiet lobby. "It is a hazardous waste nightmare. The foundational beams are rotting. The corrugated metal is completely rusted through. It is buried under 10 feet of thick poison ivy, and it is infested with feral animals. It is a complete garbage dump." Evelyn did not blink. "I will take the deed, please," she replied softly, her voice entirely steady, carrying a quiet, unshakable dignity. A local real estate developer standing nearby, dressed in an expensive cashmere overcoat and holding a custom leather briefcase, shook his head in pure amusement. He looked her up and down, taking in her dirt-smudged coat, her bruised, exhausted hands, and her battered suitcases, chuckling loudly to his associate about the crazy, desperate old woman buying a massive liability of toxic rust and splintered wood. They whispered openly about how she would freeze to death within a week, about the sheer absurdity of her purchase, and about how the city would just have to repossess the land and pay for her burial when she inevitably failed to survive the freezing winter. They laughed at her silence. They were wrong. Evelyn picked up the heavy, rusted iron key off the counter. She took the stamped, thick manila folder containing the legal deed to the abandoned Oak Haven train depot, holding it firmly against her chest. She turned her back on the warm, mocking room, stepping back out into the freezing autumn wind, ready to face the ruins. Evelyn stood at the rusted iron gates of the Oak Haven train depot as the late afternoon sun cast long, skeletal shadows across her 3 acres of untamed wilderness. The massive structure before her was a towering monument to absolute decay. It was 70 feet long and 40 feet wide, a cavernous shadow looming against the dying autumn light. The heavy slate roof sagged violently inward under the crushing weight of 5 decades of accumulated dead leaves, shattered pine branches, and harsh winter snows. The massive, 12-foot-tall wooden loading doors were violently splintered, hanging precariously off heavy iron hinges that were completely choked by thick, creeping vines of dark poison ivy. The freezing wind howled through the broken window panes, carrying the sharp, unmistakable stench of rotting timber, stagnant rainwater, and wet earth. She pushed the heavy iron key into the frozen brass padlock. It resisted for a long moment, grinding against half a century of accumulated grit and rust, before finally releasing with a sharp, heavy click. She pushed the massive door. It groaned in furious protest. Stepping inside the cavernous main waiting hall, Evelyn was immediately enveloped in a suffocating cloud of thick gray dust that danced wildly in the dim beams of light piercing through the ruined ceiling. The floor was an absolute minefield of shattered glass, rusted railroad spikes, decaying animal carcasses, and thousands upon thousands of dried rat droppings scattered across the warped wooden boards. A normal person would have fled in absolute terror. A normal person would have collapsed into a weeping heap, overwhelmed by the sheer crushing magnitude of the disaster, the freezing 40-degree Fahrenheit draft, and the terrifying isolation of being 6 miles away from any paved road or human contact. Evelyn was not normal. She set her 2 heavy suitcases down on a relatively dry patch of concrete. She did not look at the superficial trash. She looked entirely past the overwhelming mess of a forgotten era, focusing her sharp, experienced eyes exclusively on the structural integrity of the massive building.
She walked slowly toward the northern wall, her sensible brown shoes crunching loudly over the debris, and placed her bare, calloused hand against the exposed wooden framework. She pressed her fingers firmly into the timber, feeling the dense, unyielding strength of old-growth American oak that had been harvested, milled, and raised over a century ago. These beams were massive, measuring exactly 12 inches thick by 12 inches wide, and they were utterly unfazed by the moisture. She knocked her raw knuckles against the main support pillars. The sound was deep, solid, and completely hollow-free. She knelt slowly on the filthy ground, her 69-year-old knees popping quietly in the cold air. She brushed aside a thick layer of foul-smelling mud and dead leaves at the base of the wall to reveal the massive foundation below. It was not cheaply poured concrete that would crack and crumble under the freezing winter ice. It was solid, hand-cut granite block, measuring exactly 18 inches thick and extending deep into the earth, completely unmoved by the violent passage of time. Arthur lived in a pristine, fragile mansion built on lies, hollow promises, and thin drywall that would shatter with a single punch. He would have vomited at the smell of this room. He would have called a dozen lawyers to fix it for him. Evelyn simply smiled, a faint, dignified curve of her lips. "The bones are good," she whispered softly into the empty hall. The cosmetic damage was immense, but the core was indestructible. It mirrored the exhausted woman standing within its walls. She spent the next 3 hours laboring in the fading light, refusing to stop until her muscles burned with a sharp, agonizing intensity, and her breath plumed stark white in the freezing air. She walked into a smaller, enclosed room at the rear of the building, the old ticketmaster's office, and decided to make her stand there. She found a heavy, broken pine branch outside and used it as a makeshift broom, meticulously sweeping a 10 by 10-foot square in the absolute center of the room. She pushed away the shattered glass, the rusted nails, the dead insects, and the accumulated filth of a half-century, slowly creating a small, clean sanctuary amidst the overwhelming chaos. The darkness fell completely. The temperature dropped rapidly toward 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Evelyn unclasped her 2 leather suitcases, pulling out 3 heavy wool blankets she had managed to pack before being exiled from her former life. She laid them carefully on the hard, unyielding oak floorboards, creating a modest bed against the wall. From the bottom of her bag, she retrieved a small dented metal thermos filled with tap water and a tin of dry saltine crackers. She sat entirely alone in the pitch-black darkness of the abandoned train depot, chewing the stale food slowly, listening to the wind howling furiously through the massive pine trees outside. She was 69 years old, entirely alone in the dark woods, sleeping on the floor of a condemned building with exactly $0 left to her name. She lay down. She pulled the wool blankets tightly up to her chin. For the first time in 40 years, she did not have to listen to the heavy, arrogant footsteps of a man who despised her. She did not have to wait in terror for the sharp, demanding ring of the telephone. She did not have to worry about the fragile, suffocating expectations of a high society world that had violently and completely rejected her. The heavy oak beams above her head felt like the protective arms of a silent, steadfast guardian keeping the cruel world at bay. She closed her eyes. She slept perfectly.
The morning sun rose, bleeding a pale golden light through the shattered windows of the Oakhaven train depot. Evelyn awoke at exactly 5 o'clock in the morning. The air inside the ticket office was a freezing 38 degrees Fahrenheit, biting viciously at her exposed nose, her thin cheeks, and her stiff, aging joints. She pushed the 3 heavy wool blankets aside, slowly forcing her 69-year-old body to stand up from the hard oak floorboards. Her lower back throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, a stark, agonizing reminder of her age and the brutal reality of her new existence.
She did not complain. She went to work. Her first task was the systematic removal of half a century of accumulated industrial decay. She found an old, rusted iron wheelbarrow buried beneath a massive mound of dead ivy near the collapsed loading dock. Its single iron wheel squealed fiercely against the rusted axle, but it rolled. For the next 14 days, from the exact moment the sun crested the eastern pines until the thick black shadows swallowed the depot at dusk, Evelyn engaged in a brutal, unending symphony of manual labor. She hauled away 300 pounds of shattered glass shards, dragged heavy, waterlogged canvas mattresses out to the burn pile, ripped up thousands of yards of poison ivy and thorny briar patches with her bare hands, shoveled out mountains of decaying autumn leaves, swept away endless layers of thick gray dust, scrubbed the original oak floorboards with freezing well water and stiff wire brushes, and carried countless wheelbarrow loads of heavy, rusted iron scraps down the 100-yard gravel driveway. Her hands blistered, cracked, and bled. The dirt settled permanently into her skin. She simply wrapped her raw, bleeding fingers in thin strips of torn cotton ripped from an old shirt, tied them tight, and kept pulling the massive, stubborn weeds. While Arthur was undoubtedly sitting in a plush leather chair inside his heavily heated 72-degree corporate office, sipping incredibly expensive aged whiskey, wearing a custom Italian suit, and congratulating himself on his flawless legal victory over a defenseless woman, Evelyn was dragging a 70-pound section of collapsed roofing slate across the uneven, frozen ground. Her breath tore through her aging lungs like jagged ice. Her leg muscles screamed for rest, threatening to buckle beneath the sheer weight of the debris. Yet, amidst the excruciating physical pain and the overwhelming exhaustion, a profound, unshakable silence settled over her mind. The frantic, terrifying panic that had gripped her in the lawyer's sterile office completely evaporated, replaced entirely by the steady, hypnotic rhythm of a heavy hammer driving a rusted nail into solid wood. She was surviving. She was healing. On the morning of her 18th day at the depot, the sound of a heavy diesel engine shattered the quiet isolation of the woods. An old, faded red 1982 Chevrolet pickup truck slowly crunched its way down the overgrown gravel driveway, its thick tires crushing the dried leaves. It came to a halt exactly 30 feet from the main loading dock. The driver's side door creaked open, and a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out into the crisp autumn air. He appeared to be in his early 70s, wearing faded blue denim overalls, heavy leather work boots, and a worn red flannel shirt. He had a thick silver beard and deep lines etched into the corners of his eyes from decades of squinting against the harsh sun. Evelyn stopped sweeping. She gripped the heavy wooden handle of her broom, her posture rigid, her breathing shallow, her eyes completely calm. She prepared herself for the inevitable eviction notice from the county, the mocking laughter of another real estate developer, or the cruel threats that usually accompanied strange men in trucks arriving at abandoned properties. The old man did not laugh. He stood silently by his heavy steel front bumper, his calloused hands resting firmly on his hips, slowly surveying the massive property. He looked intently at the towering burn pile of rotten wood, the neatly stacked rows of salvaged iron pipes, the completely cleared driveway, and the newly swept main hall. He looked at Evelyn's exhausted, dirt-smudged face, her cracked, bandaged hands, and the quiet, fierce determination burning brightly in her dark eyes. He did not see a crazy, homeless woman waiting to freeze to death. He recognized the sacred, unmistakable dignity of honest, back-breaking labor. "I am Elias," he stated simply, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that carried over the wind. "Evelyn," she replied softly, not moving an inch. Elias nodded once. He walked to the back of his truck and dropped the heavy steel tailgate with a loud, echoing metallic crash. The entire bed of the truck was filled to the brim with expensive, heavy construction supplies. "I retired from the carpentry business 5 years ago," he said, pulling a massive roll of thick black roofing tar paper toward the edge of the truck bed. "I have 32 dozen 2x4 wooden studs, 50 pounds of galvanized steel nails, 4 gallons of premium wood sealant, and a perfectly functioning cast iron wood stove sitting in my barn collecting dust. My wife passed away 10 years ago. She hated a messy barn." He looked directly into Evelyn's eyes. "I cannot stand to see good oak rotting in the rain, and I cannot stand to see a woman working this hard without a proper framing hammer." He was not offering charity, he was offering profound respect. For the next 3 weeks, Elias arrived every single morning at exactly 7 a.m. They rarely spoke. They communicated entirely through the shared instinctual language of measuring tapes, bubble levelers, and heavy steel saws. While Evelyn scrubbed the towering interior walls and painstakingly repaired the shattered wooden window frames, Elias climbed a tall aluminum extension ladder and patched the massive gaping hole in the slate roof, sealing it tightly against the impending winter snows with thick layers of black tar. They worked together to install the heavy 300-pound cast-iron wood stove in the exact center of the old ticket office, running a thick black exhaust pipe straight up through a newly reinforced hole in the ceiling. Elias never asked about her past. He never asked about her divorce, the empty bank account, or the expensive suburban clothes she clearly did not possess. He simply handed her a box of nails, wiped the sweat from his brow, and went back to sawing wood. By the first week of November, the Oak Haven train depot was no longer a towering monument to decay. The transformation was not purely cosmetic, it was a profound, undeniable resurrection of the building's very soul. The heavy, oppressive stench of stagnant rainwater and dried rat droppings was completely gone, completely replaced by the rich, warm scent of freshly cut pine boards, polished oak floors, and deep, smoky firewood. The darkness finally broke. Evelyn stood in the exact center of the massive main waiting hall, holding a steaming tin cup of black coffee. The massive 12-foot-tall wooden loading doors had been perfectly rehung on their heavy iron hinges, sanded down to the bare grain, and treated with thick coats of amber weatherproof sealant. The shattered glass of the towering arched windows had been painstakingly cleared away and replaced with thick, clear panes that Elias had carefully salvaged from an old demolished church downtown. The morning sun breached the tree line. Golden light flooded the massive room.
It poured through the newly cleaned glass in brilliant, dazzling shafts, illuminating the rich, deep grain of the century-old oak floorboards that Evelyn had spent over 200 hours scrubbing on her hands and knees. The air was entirely free of the gray, suffocating dust that had once choked the massive space. The harsh, freezing 40-degree wind was firmly locked outside, completely unable to penetrate the thick, newly sealed wooden walls. Inside the small ticket office, the heavy cast-iron stove radiated a deep, comforting heat, pushing the internal temperature to a cozy 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Evelyn had managed to restore the old hand-cranked water pump out back, clearing the rusted pipes and drawing sweet, clear, freezing groundwater directly from a deep underground limestone aquifer. She had used a small portion of the white flour Elias had brought her to bake simple, dense buttermilk biscuits on top of the flat iron stove. The rich, mouth-watering smell of baking bread and crackling pine firewood completely filled the small, safe room. She walked slowly over to the front entrance, opening the heavy wooden door to look out at her land. Just beside the heavy stone steps, poking stubbornly through the cold, packed earth, a tiny, vibrant green sprout of wild mint had pushed its way upward toward the sunlight. It was fragile, small, but entirely, undeniably alive. Evelyn knelt down, her joints no longer popping as painfully as they had a month ago, and gently brushed a speck of brown dirt off the tiny, delicate leaf. Her muscles were tight, her lower back ached with a dull, comforting familiarity,
and her hands were heavily scarred with thick calluses. She looked back at the grand, sweeping hall. She owned this space. Every square inch of the polished floor, every sealed window pane, and every warm corner belonged entirely to her sweat, her brutal endurance, and her unyielding will to survive. She had not needed millions of dollars, hidden offshore accounts, or a team of slick attorneys in expensive silk ties to build a fortress. She had only needed a broom, a hammer, and the quiet, unshakable dignity to refuse defeat when the world threw her away. She was finally home.
The heavy iron crowbar bit deeply into the splintered edge of the final damaged floorboard. Evelyn was working meticulously in the extreme corner of the old ticket office, a tight, cramped space measuring barely 4 feet wide by 6 feet long, determined to replace the deeply rotted, moisture-warped oak planks that severely threatened to collapse under the immense weight of her newly installed cast-iron wood stove. She leaned her entire body weight backward, pulling the heavy 30-inch steel pry bar with all her remaining strength, listening closely to the agonizing screech of 70-year-old rusted nails tearing violently through the dense wooden grain. The thick board snapped loudly. It flew upward, sending a blinding, suffocating cloud of ancient gray dust spiraling wildly into the freezing air. Evelyn coughed, wiping her dirty forehead with the back of her heavily calloused hand. She reached her arm down into the dark, exposed cavity between the thick floor joists to clear out the accumulated debris. Her fingers did not touch soft earth. Her fingers did not brush against cold granite. She touched freezing, unyielding steel. Evelyn frowned. She grabbed her heavy metal flashlight, clicking the mechanical switch. A sharp, brilliant beam of white light pierced through the suffocating darkness beneath the floorboards, cutting cleanly through decades of thick gray spider webs and accumulated dead leaves. There, perfectly wedged between two massive 12-inch oak support beams and bolted securely deep into the solid granite foundation beneath, sat a massive, heavy iron safe. It was 3 feet long, 2 feet wide, and coated entirely in a thick layer of green oxidation and black grime, its heavy steel combination dials frozen completely in place by 50 years of absolute undisturbed neglect. It had been intentionally buried, completely hidden from the casual observer, heavily obscured by the thick floorboards and entirely forgotten by whatever desperate ticketmaster or corrupt railway executive had abruptly abandoned the sprawling depot during the massive railroad bankruptcies of the early 1970s. Evelyn stared at the massive iron box. She did not run out to the rural highway. She did not frantically call the local police. She calmly walked across the sweeping main hall, retrieved her heavy 5-pound steel sledgehammer, grabbed a thick steel chisel, and returned to the freezing, cramped corner. She positioned the sharp tip of the chisel directly against the heavy, rusted locking mechanism. She raised the heavy steel sledgehammer high above her shoulder. She swung downward. The deafening clash of heavy steel violently striking solid iron echoed furiously through the cavernous waiting hall, shaking the newly installed window panes and sending terrified pigeons scattering wildly from the exterior slate roof. Evelyn struck it again, and again, and again. The grueling, rhythmic pounding quickly became a hypnotic cadence, a sheer, brutal test of absolute endurance between a 69-year-old woman and half a century of rusted, stubborn defiance. Her raw, blistered hands bled slowly through her thin cotton bandages, staining the heavy wooden handle of the hammer a dark, rust-colored crimson. Sweat poured down her pale face, stinging her eyes, freezing almost instantly against her skin in the bitter 40-degree Fahrenheit draft blowing through the cracks.
For 45 agonizing minutes, she swung the heavy steel hammer without stopping. Finally, with one massive, shattering blow, the heavy iron tumblers deeply hidden inside the locking mechanism violently cracked. The thick steel locking bar suddenly gave way, snapping backward with a sharp, resonant metallic ping that hung heavily in the freezing air. Absolute silence flooded the room. Evelyn dropped the heavy sledgehammer. Her chest heaved heavily, her breath plumed white in the freezing shadows. She reached down with trembling, blood-stained fingers, firmly gripping the heavy iron handle of the massive lid. She pulled upward with all her might. The heavy steel door screamed in terrible agony, the rusted hinges grinding fiercely against each other as they were forced open for the exact first time in over 50 years. A stale, incredibly dry pocket of preserved air rushed out, carrying the faint, distinct, intoxicating scent of old paper, aged leather, and expensive machine oil. She aimed her heavy metal flashlight directly into the dark cavern. It was not filled with rotting paper money. It was not filled with worthless copper pennies. The interior of the massive iron box was entirely lined with thick, waterproof waxed canvas, perfectly preserving an astonishing, meticulously organized historical archive of immense, undeniable value. She reached her dirty, trembling hand inside, gently pulling out a heavy, dark brown leather satchel. She untied the thick leather cords, opening the heavy flap. Inside lay hundreds upon hundreds of pristine, uncashed, heavily watermarked bearer bonds from the original Transcontinental Railway Corporation, dating exactly back to 1922. The thick, creamy cotton rag paper was entirely undamaged, the intricate green and gold ink completely vibrant, and the attached dividend coupons entirely uncut. In the complex world of high finance, these specific historical railroad bonds were not simply pieces of paper. They were incredibly rare, untraceable historical artifacts, heavily sought after by elite private collectors, massive banking institutions, and wealthy historians. She dug deeper into the dark vault. Beneath the massive stacks of financial bonds, wrapped carefully in thick, oily velvet cloths, lay a breathtaking collection of solid 14-karat gold, heavily engraved pocket watches. They were the personalized, highly coveted retirement gifts given exclusively to the founding railroad tycoons, entirely untouched by the destructive passage of time, their heavy brass chains pooling like liquid light in the beam of her flashlight. At the very bottom, resting flat against the cold steel floor, sat a massive, waterproof copper cylinder containing the original, hand-drawn architectural blueprints of the entire state's railway expansion, signed directly by the chief engineers in 1918. Evelyn sat completely frozen on the splintered oak floorboards. The brilliant beam of the flashlight illuminated the glittering gold and the pristine historical paper resting quietly in her bruised, filthy hands. The woman who had been violently discarded from a 40-year marriage with exactly $22, forced to sleep in a freezing, rusted station wagon and laughed at by arrogant men in expensive suits, was now holding the lost, forgotten treasury of an entire industrial empire. She did not scream in triumph. She did not weep tears of joy. She simply folded the leather flap, secured the heavy cords, and placed the satchel back into the dark vault. She closed the heavy iron lid.
Evelyn waited exactly 3 days before making her move. She walked the 6 miles back to the municipal limits, fed 3 silver quarters into a rusted public payphone outside the local pharmacy, and dialed the direct, unlisted number of a highly renowned historical archivist based in Chicago. She did not boast, she did not stutter. She simply listed the exact serial numbers printed on the 1922 Transcontinental Railway bonds and hung up the heavy plastic receiver. 48 hours later,
A sleek black Lincoln town car slowly crunched down the dirt driveway. A tall, incredibly thin man wearing a meticulously tailored gray wool suit and carrying a heavy, combination-locked aluminum briefcase stepped out into the freezing November air. His name was Mr. Sterling. He was a senior authenticator for a massive, globally recognized auction house, a man who spent his life analyzing the forgotten fortunes of deceased billionaires and bankrupt empires. He looked at the cleared brush, the neatly stacked firewood, and the imposing, beautifully restored oak doors of the depot. He did not mock the dirt on Evelyn's face. He simply bowed his head in a quiet, respectful greeting. They walked inside. The cast-iron stove radiated a steady 72 degrees Fahrenheit. Evelyn led him into the cramped ticket office, pointing silently to the heavy leather satchel resting on the small pine table Elias had built. Mr. Sterling snapped open his briefcase, carefully extracting a pair of pristine white cotton gloves and a thick, highly magnified jeweler's loupe. He picked up the first bundle of paper. He leaned directly under the bright beam of Evelyn's metal flashlight. For exactly 45 seconds, the room was completely, overwhelmingly silent. The only sound was the fierce autumn wind howling against the thick window panes and the quiet, steady crackle of the burning pine logs inside the heavy iron stove. Mr. Sterling slowly turned the creamy cotton rag paper over, examining the intricate green and gold ink, tracing the pristine watermarks, and verifying the uncut dividend coupons. He placed the bonds down carefully. He unwrapped the heavy 14-karat gold pocket watches, opening their delicate latches to expose the flawless, handcrafted mechanical gears that had not ticked in over 50 years. He unrolled the heavy copper cylinder, his breath catching audibly in his throat as he saw the original 1918 signatures of the chief railway engineers. He removed his magnifying loupe. He took off his white cotton gloves. "I have worked in this exact profession for 32 years, Mr. Sterling whispered, his voice trembling slightly, carrying a profound, undeniable reverence. I have appraised the private estates of oil barons, I have catalogued European royal vaults, and I have handled the rarest artifacts in modern American history. But I have never, in my entire life, seen an archive of this magnitude preserved so perfectly." He looked directly into Evelyn's exhausted, deeply lined eyes. "The bearer bonds alone are incredibly rare, fully transferable and completely untraceable," he stated firmly, pulling a leather-bound ledger from his briefcase. "With the current aggressive market demand for private historical collectors, combined with the pure gold weight of the engraved timepieces and the unprecedented historical significance of the architectural blueprints, the minimum absolute baseline valuation for this entire collection is exactly $2,400,000. $2,400,000. Evelyn heard the massive number. She did not gasp. She did not jump up and down. She did not scream in absolute triumph, and she did not collapse onto the solid oak floorboards in a puddle of tears. She simply stood perfectly still, her bruised, calloused hands resting heavily against the rough fabric of her wool coat. She thought of the $22 she had walked away with. She thought of the blistering pain in her lower spine as she hauled 300 pounds of shattered glass in a rusted iron wheelbarrow. She looked at the blazing fire inside the stove. She was safe. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," she replied softly, her voice carrying the quiet, absolute peace of a mountain that had weathered a catastrophic storm. "Please arrange the auction." She poured him a tin cup of hot black coffee. They sat by the fire. They waited for the world to change.
The blinding, explosive news of the $2,400,000 historical auction could not be contained within the quiet, shadowy walls of the private collector's market for long. It leaked out through whispered phone calls, spilled onto the glossy pages of elite financial magazines, and eventually slammed violently onto the polished mahogany desk of the very man who had thrown the rightful owner out onto the freezing streets. Arthur was drowning. Behind the carefully manufactured facade of his expensive, custom-tailored navy Italian silk suits and his perfectly styled silver hair, the reality of his stolen empire was rapidly crumbling into absolute dust. Without Evelyn's meticulous, invisible hand guiding the complex daily logistics, balancing the heavy ledgers, and maintaining the vital shipping contracts, the freight company had suffered a catastrophic collapse. In less than 6 months, Arthur had recklessly over-leveraged the business, accumulating exactly $3,500,000 in toxic corporate debt. His offshore accounts were frozen, his massive suburban estate was heavily mortgaged to the breaking point, and the banks were aggressively circling his remaining assets like starving wolves. He needed a miracle. He decided to steal hers. On a freezing Tuesday morning, the harsh, arrogant roar of a pristine silver 1965 Jaguar tore through the quiet isolation of the woods. Arthur drove recklessly down the uneven, overgrown gravel driveway, his expensive rubber tires crushing the frozen pine cones, his manicured hands gripping the polished wooden steering wheel with desperate, greedy tension. He parked exactly 30 feet from the heavy stone steps of the Oak Haven train depot. He stepped out of his heavily heated 80-degree leather interior and into the biting 35-degree Fahrenheit November wind. He stared up at the massive structure. He could not believe his eyes. The rotting, collapsed garbage dump his lawyers had laughed about was completely gone. In its place stood a towering, magnificent fortress of perfectly sealed old-growth oak, gleaming glass, and quiet, undeniable strength. A steady column of gray smoke drifted peacefully from the heavy iron chimney, carrying the rich, warm scent of burning pine. Evelyn was standing near the towering stack of firewood, wearing her heavy flannel shirt, her thick denim work pants, and her heavy leather boots. She was holding a massive 8-pound steel splitting axe in her heavily calloused, bruised hands. She did not stop her work. She did not flinch. She simply raised the heavy iron axe high above her shoulder and brought it down with a vicious, echoing crack, cleanly splitting a thick 14-inch pine log entirely in half. Arthur adjusted his expensive silk tie, forcing a bright, sickeningly fake smile onto his pale face. "Evelyn, my dear," he called out warmly, carefully navigating the muddy ground in his handmade leather loafers. "I have been so worried about you, living out here all alone in the freezing cold at your age. It is not safe." Evelyn set the heavy axe down. She looked at him. Her eyes were completely hollow of affection, completely devoid of fear, and utterly still. She looked at his shivering frame, his desperate, darting eyes, and the pathetic, transparent greed radiating from every single pore of his body. "We are still a family, Evelyn," he lied smoothly, taking another step closer, his voice dripping with absolute, sickening manipulation. "You are 69 years old. You are not mentally equipped to handle a multi-million-dollar historical asset. Let me bring my financial team in. We can share the profits, just like the old days." "Get off my property," she stated calmly. Arthur's fake smile instantly vanished, entirely replaced by a mask of cruel, vicious rage. "You bought this land with marital funds," he screamed, dropping the polite act, his face turning a dark, furious crimson as the freezing wind whipped his silver hair. That $11 came from my bank account. You are a crazy, unstable old woman hiding my assets. I will take you to court, I will have you declared mentally incompetent, and I will take every single penny of that money." He spun around, marched back to his shiny car, and sped away. He kept his promise. 14 days later, Evelyn found herself sitting in the exact same brightly lit downtown courthouse where her life had been violently dismantled just months prior. The room was aggressively heated to 72 degrees Fahrenheit. Arthur sat across the aisle, surrounded by an army of aggressive, expensive lawyers wearing dark suits, completely armed with an 80-page legal injunction demanding immediate total guardianship over Evelyn's newly discovered estate, citing her advanced age, her delusional living conditions, and the alleged use of hidden marital funds. They painted her as a helpless, confused victim. They were completely, utterly wrong. Evelyn sat perfectly still at the heavy defense table, wearing a clean, simple gray wool dress. She did not bring an army of slick, aggressive sharks. She sat beside a single, incredibly sharp senior litigation attorney, provided and heavily retained by the Chicago auction house, paid for entirely by a massive advance on the Transcontinental Railway bonds. Arthur's lead attorney stood up, puffing out his chest, waving his thick, heavy documents, and loudly demanding that the court freeze all assets immediately to protect his client from his ex-wife's vicious, calculated financial fraud. Evelyn's lawyer stood up slowly. He did not yell. He did not wave his arms. He simply opened a thin manila folder and extracted a single stamped legal document, sliding it smoothly across the polished mahogany table toward the 60-year-old female judge. "Your Honor," the lawyer began quietly, his voice echoing perfectly in the silent room. "The plaintiff is claiming a right to the defendant's estate based on marital assets. However, I have here the absolute, heavily ironclad divorce decree, drafted, finalized, and aggressively pushed through by the plaintiff himself." The judge adjusted her glasses, reading the heavy black ink. "Section 4, paragraph 12, the lawyer continued, his tone turning as cold as ice. "The plaintiff legally, voluntarily, and permanently severed all claims to any future assets, properties, or windfalls acquired by the defendant following the exact date and time of the final signature. Furthermore, the $11 used to purchase the municipal tax deed was completely verified by the county clerk to have been acquired from the exact $22 the plaintiff maliciously left her with after dissolving the marriage." Arthur's face drained of all color. "In addition, Your Honor," the lawyer added, striking the final lethal blow, "we have obtained public bankruptcy filings from yesterday morning. The plaintiff is currently $3,500,000 in debt. This lawsuit is not about marital rights. It is a desperate, pathetic attempt to steal from a woman he abandoned, simply to save himself from his own catastrophic incompetence." The judge looked up from the papers. She looked at Arthur with absolute, unmasked disgust. "Case dismissed with prejudice," she stated firmly. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Arthur did not scream. He did not argue with his expensive lawyers. He stood up slowly, his legs trembling violently beneath his custom-tailored suit. The devastating, suffocating weight of $3 million of toxic debt crashed upon his shoulders, crushing the breath entirely from his lungs. He looked across the aisle at Evelyn, searching desperately for a single shred of pity, a single tear, or a single moment of the quiet devotion she had freely given him for 40 years. Evelyn simply packed her leather handbag. She walked out of the courtroom, her head held incredibly high, leaving him to drown in the absolute, silent ruin of his own making.
The massive wire transfer of exactly $2,400,000 cleared her newly established, deeply secure bank account exactly 3 weeks after the historic auction concluded in Chicago. Evelyn did not buy a mansion. She did not purchase expensive imported silk dresses. She did not hire a fleet of luxury vehicles, and she did not seek out the hollow, fragile validation of the superficial high society world that had so easily and cruelly discarded her. Instead, she poured the immense fortune directly back into the deep, dark earth of the 3 acres she had painfully saved from absolute ruin. She hired Elias as her permanent head of restoration, paying him generously for his unwavering loyalty. Together, they ordered 40 tons of rich black agricultural topsoil, planted 600 feet of fragrant climbing jasmine along the rusted iron fences, purchased 80 mature American oak saplings to line the winding gravel driveway, and transformed the cavernous main hall of the Oak Haven train depot into a magnificent, warmly glowing community sanctuary. She filled the massive 70-foot room with heavy, hand-carved cedar tables. She installed thousands of thick, hardcover books along the newly reinforced walls, established a sprawling, vibrant vegetable garden in the rear lot, and kept the heavy cast-iron stove burning bright red all winter. She intentionally opened her massive oak doors to any weary traveler, lost soul, or broken person who simply needed a safe, warm place to sit in the quiet. She healed the land. The land healed her. A thick, silvery morning mist rolled gently across the sprawling, beautifully manicured property as the sun slowly rose, painting the quiet autumn sky in breathtaking deep shades of violet and pale gold. The crisp morning air hovered peacefully at a cool 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Evelyn sat completely still on the heavy cedar front porch Elias had carefully built for her, wearing her familiar faded red flannel shirt and her thick denim work pants, her sensible brown shoes resting firmly on the polished, sealed wood. She held a cup. The rich, dark scent of bitter black coffee mingled perfectly with the sweet, damp smell of fallen pine needles and freshly turned soil. She listened closely to the gentle, rhythmic rustling of the cool wind moving steadily through the towering trees, the distant cheerful melody of a wild red cardinal perched high upon the restored iron gate, and the steady, deeply comforting crackle of the pine firewood burning safely inside her home. Her hands were permanently scarred, heavily calloused, and deeply marked by the brutal, agonizing labor of her survival, yet they rested with absolute, unshakable peace in her lap. Miles away, in the cold, sterile city, Arthur's massive freight empire was entirely liquidated by ruthless creditors. His expensive vintage cars were violently repossessed by aggressive banking institutions, and his arrogant name was completely, permanently erased from the elite corporate ledgers. He was gone. Evelyn took a slow breath. She was free. The most valuable thing she found buried beneath those freezing, rotting oak floorboards was not the incredibly rare historical treasure, nor the millions of dollars it subsequently brought her, but the profound, undeniable opportunity to discover her own unyielding strength when violently stripped of absolutely everything. The cruel, arrogant men of the world eagerly took away the grand houses, the massive bank accounts, and the superficial things that could easily be counted on a sterile spreadsheet. But they completely forgot the one vital, enduring thing that could never be bought with any amount of money: the ability to start over.
If you found peace and quiet inspiration in Evelyn's incredible journey of fierce survival and absolute justice, please gently like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of unyielding resilience and the undeniable truth of karma.